General Shafter announced the embarkation for Cuba. A free-for-all ensued.
The scene in Tampa was just chaotic, with people fighting to get on board ships and elbowing other guys aside to get on board ships, and no staff officers there to help, and no plan or rhyme or reason to it. This was all brand new, and they were just terrible at it. Shafter was handling problems that no American Army officer before ever had to handle. This was a general staff that had been built to fight the Indian Wars. And all of a sudden, they're going to undertake the most difficult of all military operations, an amphibious offensive against a defended shoreline.
The Rough Riders became an infantry regiment because there wasn't sufficient space on the ships to bring these horses over. TR just moved ahead very aggressively to make sure that his boys got a place on the boats. As it was, not all the Rough Riders did get on transports, and many of them were left behind with the horses in Tampa, Florida.
10,000 troops and much of the ammunition and medical supplies never made it aboard. For the 15,000 soldiers who departed for Cuba on June 14th, the confusion in Tampa seemed far behind.
Today, we are steaming southward through a sapphire sea. Wind rippled under an almost cloudless sky. If we are allowed to succeed, we have scored the first triumph in what will be a world movement. Colonel Theodore Roosevelt.
A week later, the treacherous shoreline was a sobering sight for U.S. troops. General Shafter directed his ships to Daiquiri, 22 miles east of Santiago, where his soldiers could disembark onto a small dock. Cuban insurgents had driven Spanish forces from the area so that the U.S. Army could land unopposed.
So you get this scene in the D-Day for 1898. The guys come down off the ships into the rowboats, pretty heavy sea, and they're coming into a wharf. And when they get on a rise, they have to throw their weapons up onto the wharf, and then down they go again, and then they rise again, and they grab up for guys that are up there on top to help them to get out. Now, of course, this didn't do any good with their horses and mules. You couldn't take them in on rowboats. What are you going to do with them? Well, you throw them overboard, and they'll swim to shore, and then you gather them up.
TR had 2 horses for his own use, which had been put on the ships. One horse was named Rain in the Face, and one was Texas. They lowered Rain in the Face into the water. Rain in the Face died, drowned, in place before the harnesses got off. At the same point, little Texas went right into the drink. His head came up, he looked around, and he started swimming out to sea. On the shore, the bugler saw this and began blowing. And Texas heard the bugle call and turned around and started swimming into shore.
The next day, the U.S. landing continued at Siboney, a beachhead 7 miles west of Daiquiri.
The cowboys and Indians couldn't swim. They'd never really seen water. The cowboys kept referring to the ocean as the crick. And when they got ashore, of course, their uniforms were wool, they were hot, and the dye started coming off. And most of them stripped down and just wore their sombreros. So by the end of the day, you had all these new Rough Riders with cowboy hats on, working in the surf, trying to get stuff in.
1,000 naked men were assisting and impeding the progress shoreward of their comrades. An army was being landed with more cheers and shrieks and laughter than rise from bathers in the surf at Coney Island. Richard Harding Davis.
Once ashore, U.S. troops encountered Cuban rebels for the first time.
Well, the American soldiers had been reading stories about Cuba in the press, and they were completely unprepared for the reality of it. These rebel soldiers didn't have uniforms. Often they didn't have guns. They were dirt poor, starving men in rags, and also they were largely black.
I thought from their appearance that they would prove useful as guides and scouts, but that we would have to do practically all the fighting. Captain John Bigelow, Jr., 10th Cavalry.
And so the immediate effect of the U.S. arrival is to appropriate the conduct of the war. And so we now begin what becomes known as the Spanish-American War, in which the very title of it signifies the absence of Cubans.
Images of U.S. soldiers preparing their advance were captured by cameramen sent to Cuba by Thomas Edison. The size of early cameras prevented the filming of actual battles, so Edison shot reenactments in New Jersey. In reality, U.S. soldiers were unready for their first encounter with the Spanish. 27-year-old author Stephen Crane, a reporter for the New York World, marched alongside Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. They reached Las Guasimas, 3 miles north of Siboney, on June 24th.
Theodore Roosevelt was rather typical in some ways of these leaders who had very little combat experience. Stephen Crane happened to notice that he kept hearing these sounds of a dove, this coo, 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 and he thought he recognized that as the signal used by the Spanish scouts. Roosevelt wouldn't listen to this when the Cubans warned him that the Spanish were around, and they did walk right into a terrible ambush.
And so the potential asset of the Cuban rebels was not exploited to anywhere near the degree that it could have been. Rebels can supply intelligence. They're there on the scene. They can say there's a Spanish company over here, and they got some artillery over here, and that bridge isn't defended, and you can count on that intelligence. It's the best intelligence of all. I saw it.
The Spanish killed and wounded 16 U.S. soldiers before withdrawing to the San Juan Heights, just east of Santiago. From atop the ridge of Las Guasimas, General Shafter and his aides surveyed the terrain.
I don't think there was any great debate about what had to be done. They decided to mount a two-prong attack, one on the San Juan Heights, which stood between them and Santiago, and the other on El Caney, where the Spanish had amassed a sizable military force, which would be on the Americans' right flank as they fought in the San Juan Hills.
General Shafter ordered his commanders to attack both El Caney and the San Juan Heights at dawn on July 1st. At El Caney, 5,000 U.S. troops faced 500 well-entrenched Spanish defenders.
The American battery kept up a leisurely fire on the stone fort, eliciting no reply, and so little disturbing the Spanish that someone suggested they were dummies. Captain Arthur Lee, British military attaché.
The Spaniards then aimed their volleys on our attacking line. We dropped to the ground and fired at will. Men fell in front of me, to my right and left. Private Edward Henry, 21st Infantry.
It was not until late afternoon that U.S. forces had taken El Caney. Among those wounded was New York Journal reporter James Creelman, who had tried to recover the Spanish flag from atop the stone fort.
James Creelman got carried away, and he had his pistol. He drew his pistol and started shooting and ran up the hill and took a bullet in the back and fell over, thought he was dying. And the next thing he knew was he woke from his daze, and there was Hearst leaning over him, wearing a straw hat with a nice ribbon in it. And he said, "Well, I'm sorry you're shot, but wasn't it a splendid fight? We beat all the other newspapers."
This was just wonderful for the newspapers. Coming out of Depression, all the news had been bad news. Here came a war, and it was a glorious war to cover. Exotic place, an enemy that it was easy to despise, real heroes, all the color of the Rough Riders.
That same day, the Rough Riders and 9,000 other U.S. troops, including 3 black regiments, formed southwest of El Caney to take the San Juan Heights. U.S. commanders planned first to cross the San Juan River at the base of the heights, then to take Kettle Hill, just west of the San Juan River.